Hi, everyone. Welcome back. This is my third session today. Robert, how many have you done today?
I have done one so far.
Okay, so this is, we're well underway for our Launch 2018 event, presenting a lot of sessions to help you guys build labs on our platform, whether that be virtualized labs, cloud-based labs, hooking into external services, and all of that sort of thing. In this case, what we want to do is we know a lot of you guys have used our platform for a while and already built labs and more of the traditional lab model where you're working with things like virtual machines that are running in a data center, and maybe you have a lab that's in a physical classroom. Maybe you offer it online, but you're still dealing with the virtual machine model and using that for training purposes. And so in this case, we want to help you figure out, well, that's great because there's still a lot of learning opportunities there, but then there's this cloud thing. And when you're looking at training in the cloud, what does that mean? How do you take your experience and your skills that you built with dealing with labs in a virtualized environment and carry that into the cloud? What are the kind of things that you need to think about? And so this lab is your introduction to that. But in this case, I keep saying the cloud, but this is specifically about Azure, because Azure is the place that the cloud that we've invested in the most heavily so far. And Robert's been a huge developer in terms of effort behind that. And so we want to help you make that transition into Azure and figure out what's it going to take for you to get there, and what are the things that you need to get started. My name is Kirk Munro. I didn't introduce myself already, but I've done a bunch of other sessions. My name is Kirk Munro, and I am a senior product manager at Learn on Demand Systems. And Robert, with me here, is one of the lead developers at Learn on Demand Systems. So, and we work a lot closely together on all of this stuff. So I'm looking forward to this session. So the purpose, I already kind of went through this. So the purpose is just, if you're already involved in lab development, or if you're planning or thinking about getting involved in lab development that are going to run in or on Microsoft Azure, what are the things that you need to think about? And so with that, I think the first thing that we should do is probably talk about an introduction to Azure. So, because a lot of people, they hear about Azure, they hear about cloud, but maybe they don't necessarily know exactly what that means, how that compares and contrasts to labs that run in a virtualized environment. And so we're just going to want to fast track that and help you understand what that's all about. And then get into some discussions about things like, how do you choose between Cloud Slice and Azure Pass, because we have multiple ways that you can leverage Azure. And then resources that are going to help you get started with Cloud Slice. And I've got a nagging feeling, and it could be that I had one more bullet that is later on in the slides that I didn't put here, and so we might see an additional thing show up. It'll remind me when I get there. But at any rate,
bonus topic, right?
That's right, bonus topic. So like an Easter egg. There we go. So the best way for us to talk about Azure and to really help you understand what that's about and do the comparing and contrasting that I was talking about is to show you a demo. So I'm just going to flip over to my lab environment. Now, in this case, I'm actually going to use a lab to demo Azure concepts with you, just because it's very easy for me to get off the ground running with an account. So just bear with me while I fire up this lab.
Now, already this looks a little bit different than a virtual machine hosted lab, right?
Yes, correct.
Because we're launching into the cloud environment, the cloud console, versus the standard setup. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you might notice too, that was really, really peppy. Like that launched really quickly. If you are bringing students into a cloud-based lab, you can bring them in very fast. And because because it's using services that are running and ready and available 24/7, a lot more than virtualized hardware that might be in a saved or powered off state and needs to be spun up and brought back online, you can just get in there like that. It's really, really snappy.
And even if we have something that takes a long time to provision, we can let the student into the lab and they can start working before the provisioning on the Azure side is complete, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
If that resource is being used at the end of the lab, then we can let them get started in the beginning, which gets them in even faster.
For sure. So yeah, so there's a bunch of different scenarios. When you're dealing with, a virtual machine is equivalent to a student sitting down and powering up that computer that they're working with, and maybe there's a bunch of other computers that they're leveraging, servers and things they're connecting with inside of an entire, organization or configuration, I should say, that you have set up. In the case of cloud, you have configuration as well. You can bring them in from ground zero and just have them in Azure. You can bring them in where the resources are already provisioned, and maybe they had to wait a minute or two just for those resources to be set up. Or you can bring them in where they get started using the lab, but resources are being set up for them in the background, like Robert mentioned, and then they kind of get off the ground running while additional work is being done. So when you move into the world of services like Azure and building clouds on Azure, there's a lot more flexibility and capability for what you can do than when you're dealing with virtual machines, which are fairly rigid in structure.
So when you speak of resources, and we're not talking about a virtual machine, what kind of resources are you talking about?
Oh, that's a great question. Good segue. So I'm going to show you what I'm talking about right now. So hang on a second here, just while I log in. This is using our cloud. If you haven't seen this before, this is our Cloud Slice login experience where we bring students to a portal, and they may have instructions. Most labs would. In this case, I just wanted to get you into the portal and talk about Azure, so I didn't throw instructions in this lab.
And this is just a web page. There is no desktop associated with the lab at all.
Correct.
This right here is the taskbar and everything. That's your local machine, and everything that you see in the web page is actually the Azure portal and not a virtual machine, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely right. So I'm just logging in using a student account that we provisioned using Cloud Slice. You'll hear Cloud Slice a lot if you watch our sessions today and tomorrow, because we are doing a lot of work with Cloud Slice, and we think it's a very powerful technology. But in this case, I've basically what I'm doing is I'm leveraging an Azure subscription, and I'll talk about what a subscription is in a minute. And then I create a user account. Well, actually, that's done for me. Our platform creates a user account, gives me that user account and the password, and then I can log in and actually do that work. And actually, Robert, why don't you chat about what exactly a subscription is while I just grab a drink of water, because I can feel I need to.
Yeah, absolutely. So a subscription in Azure is basically an entire isolated system where you can create users, you can create databases, and you can create something called a resource group, which is like a little container for anything that you would want to provision in Azure. You could put databases or whatever you like. Now with a subscription, that's also the way that you are billed. Your billing goes back to your subscription ID. And that's how Microsoft tracks which resources go back to which account or credit card or whatnot. So within a subscription, you can create users, you can link up an Active Directory, and you get full control over everything. Now, the problem that we run into is that if you have to give everybody their own subscription, it can get a little bit difficult to manage this. So that's where we kind of came into the concept of Cloud Slice. We can use a single subscription versus issuing full subscriptions to everybody.
Mm-hmm. And it's a great concept too, because if you think about, I think about a pizza, right? So if I put a pizza out here on the table and I said, everybody come on and grab a slice, everybody has their own fair share of the pie, unless they take more than their share.
And the box is a subscription, right?
And that's right. The box is the subscription. And so you can just grab little pieces that you want to use and then work with those. And each student can do that. Now, I'm actually going to segue here as well. So just talking about pizza and talking about Cloud Slice Lab. So we're to talk about pizza with respect to this. But at any rate, when you're dealing with cloud and Azure, and right here I'm inside of the Azure portal, you are dealing with finite resources, not infinite resources. People might think, oh, the cloud, it's everything. It's as big as I want it to be. I can put whatever I want in there. But that's true, but you need to a certain degree, but you need to prepare it for that. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, about how you prepare it for that, but I just kind of wanted to mention that because the pizza analogy, you take all the slices of pizza and there's no more left. Well, you take all of the resources that are available in your subscription and there's no more left. And so there's some thought that needs to be put into that, but we'll segue to that.
Well, what do they say about the cloud? It's basically just somebody else's hardware, right? But it's still running on hardware.
That's exactly it. And that's a great point. And I'll give you a story because I had a really interesting story related to hardware and the limitations that I'll share with you guys once we get to that point. So what you're looking at right here, and let me just go full screen on this because I don't need the panel on the right. This is the Azure portal. Now, in this case, it looks pretty empty, and that's because I'm using a slice. But if this was a brand new subscription and I came in, it would look pretty empty because it would be a brand new subscription. And so if you're not used to Azure, it's basically, when you log into Azure, and you're dealing with the resources that are available, it's similar to when you log into Active Directory installed in your own environment and you're dealing with all the servers that you've got configured and available. But by default, you get off the ground running and it's empty. And when you think about a virtual lab setup and you think about virtual machines, you need to design your lab. So maybe your lab is about teaching Exchange or SharePoint or SQL Server, or maybe it's about teaching some Linux product and you're dealing with virtual machines on Linux. You need to think about what you're teaching, what resources are required, both in terms of hardware and software, because, hardware, well, if you have a class that is in a training center and your room can hold 30 students because you got 30 computers, then you know, okay, I can take a class size of 30 people. That's fairly easy math. And as long as you have the hardware available, you can support the students. And with cloud, you're still setting up resources, but you're not taking boxes that are computers and setting up a desk with a monitor and putting this box that represents, this laptop represents for me storage, as well as networking, and as well as compute, because it's got a CPU. And so this represents a lot of resources inside of a package in my laptop here in front of me.
A laptop that size has to have a lot of resources in it.
This laptop has a lot of resources in it. It does. I have 3 SSD drives in this thing. I'm very proud of that. Anyway, so when you're dealing with cloud and you're setting students up to work with resources, they are going to create these bundles that represent what might have been a virtual machine or a computer or a laptop in the past, but now it's a bundle that is a collection of hardware and software pieces that do something together. And so you get into the notion from logging into Azure with an account in a subscription, and that account is a member of Azure Active Directory, just like there's Active Directory outside of Azure, there's Active Directory in Azure. And you get into the notion of resource groups. And a resource group is just what you think it is by name. It's a group of resources, hardware resources, software resources, could be websites, virtual machines, databases, networking resources, serverless resources like Azure Functions and Logic apps that are more on the software side of the fence. And so it's you're configuring all these little bundles that you want your students to use to learn, just like you would configure a virtual machine with hardware and software that you want to use for students to learn. So the concepts are the same. They translate very well. Your resource group is your computer, but what it actually has in it defines what it can actually do and how students are going to use it.
So it's kind of almost like it's a sandbox that you set up and they get to play in, or almost kind of like an environment that you configure for them, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Within that subscription. And based on what you have on the screen here, if there were multiple labs running, would one user be able to see the resource group of another user?
Oh, in the Cloud Slice, no. So Cloud Slice students only see the resources that are assigned to them. And so I'm in a Cloud Slice right now, and Robert, if you fired up this lab and I clicked on resource groups again, or I clicked on refresh, I wouldn't see yours, I would only see mine. So Cloud Slice is great because it isolates them from one another. We have 2 principal ways of working with Azure inside of our platform. We have Cloud Slice, which is one subscription or a set, and we'll talk about that shortly. But anyway, a subscription that we break up into chunks, and we give each student a chunk, and that chunk may be pre-configured with the resource packages, one or more, because I've got one resource group here, but there's nothing stopping me from creating a Cloud Slice that has multiple resource groups to define multiple packages, just like I could create a lab that has multiple virtual machines, where each virtual machine is its own package, and that they can work together. And so you define what those packages are. And so in Cloud Slice, yeah, each student gets their own. Or the other thing that we have is support for Azure Passes, or bring your own subscription for that matter, where you're dealing with a full-on Azure subscription, and there's no multiple students each coming in and grabbing a piece of it. Each student is like, no, this is mine. Nobody can have it. This is mine. Don't touch it. And all my resources in it, I'm keeping them. And so anyway, we'll talk about some of the differences there. But that scenario for Azure Passes, each student gets their own subscription, and they see everything that's in it. So it's God mode, if you will, if you're a gamer.
So it's kind of fuzzy at this point. You have resource groups and then you have resources, but how does that present itself as a lab? I mean, there's a lot of different stuff you could do, right? You can do Azure Portal training, or you can actually have just a resource that gets set up and then let the student access those resources through a virtual machine, right? I mean, there's a whole lot of options there, given that you can configure a resource group or the resources in it however you want. So that's kind of another interesting thing is when you're setting up the sandbox, like how do you know what to put in there? How do you know what to do and what not to do? And I guess that really depends on the direction you're going with your lab, right?
Right, absolutely. And that actually, so that reminds me of a cool lab that you did recently, which was where you can create a cloud slice and have resources deployed. In his case, he was setting up a website inside of Azure, but he doesn't bring students into the Azure portal because it wasn't necessarily about learning Azure. He brings them into this website. And so you can have a cloud slice where, I mean, if you think about the idea that going to the virtual machine model, you could set up a virtual machine and where the student sits down and they're not dealing with the operating system, but they're told to go to this website and work with this website and configure it and do these things. Well, same idea with cloud, and Robert has set up a lab where instead of bringing them to the Azure portal, he brings them directly to the management page for the website so they can work at that level. So you have a lot more, it's a lot more fuzzy, which I guess the cloud terminology fits really, really well here. You have a lot more control over the resources that are in the bundles or the resource groups for each student, and when you set that up, where you bring the student to actually start working with those resources. And that's up to you how you set that up. If you watched the Skunkworks presentation that I did earlier with Corey, or if you didn't, I encourage you to go and watch that recording. That shows some interesting and unique ways to bring students into resources that are not just working inside of an Azure portal, and just different ways to think about how you can actually create labs. It's a really, really flexible platform, and there's a lot you can do.
So what about subscriptions? We need a subscription to get started. So how do we obtain a subscription? What are the options there?
So yeah, you can go to Azure and you can purchase a subscription. If you've never had one, you can request a trial. So you can get a trial subscription. I forget what the durations are for that. There are a fair Azure. When you deal with cloud, because it is a collection of resources, some that are very big, some that are very minute, each one has their own pricing. And so there are certain ones that are free, other ones that cost money. And so you're dealing with subscriptions instead of going out and buying, a one-time bill. Here's this, give me the invoice for this piece of hardware in this computer and I'm going to go. You're dealing with a lot more itemized costs for all these things. But the actual way you go about doing it is creating a trial, buying an Azure Pass, because you can get an Azure Pass where you prepay for a subscription or where you add a credit card down and say, okay, I want to spend up to a certain amount on the subscription. Or you can just go into a full-on recurring monthly subscription where you have a certain spend and you can manage that spend through some of Azure tooling in terms of where you don't want it to go over a certain limit and things like that. So there's really a lot of flexibility for getting started with your own subscription and for these things. Oh, and I should mention, if you are using, and you'll hear us talk about this in some other talks too, if you are using your own, if you're using Azure Pass, students have their own subscription. If you're using Cloud Slice, students are sharing. The best practice is to have a dedicated subscription for cloud slicing. Don't just grab your subscription that you're using for a whole lot of other stuff and it's got production things on there, and if something goes wonky, it would be very bad. Don't go and just use that for cloud slicing. You're much better off just separating out roles, thinking, okay, I've got my production stuff I use at the organization. I'm teaching labs on Cloud Slice. This is my subscription for Cloud Slice. It helps from a billing perspective, using exactly what's being spent on your labs and separating that from what's being spent on production things. It helps just from clearer separation of roles, because teaching and learning in a sandbox is a lot more vague, and people might do some interesting things you hadn't thought about versus doing production, which is more controlled and managed tightly, right? So just make sure you don't just think, okay, I've got a subscription in Azure already, so let's just start using it for Cloud Slice, because that's not really a good idea. You should have a separate subscription for this sort of thing. Now, I just want to quickly get into something. So I'm just going to show you. I've got a resource group here already created for me. I could have created a new one if I owned this subscription, but in Cloud Slice, resource groups are created for me. And I'm going to add a new resource inside of here.
Now, did you put any restrictions on this? Can the student go in and create anything, or are they being restricted as to what they can and not create?
So in this case, I've got I've got carte blanche. I can create whatever I like. There's no restrictions whatsoever. So if I want to go and throw a really expensive virtual machine that costs $1,000 a minute on here, and Azure has one, I can do it. But obviously, you don't want students to go and do that. And we have policy support so that you can actually restrict what students can and cannot create. You can give students resources that they have read-only access to. You can give students resource groups that they have contributor access to or owner access to, where they can go and actually create stuff, but say, configure it such that they can only create a specific virtual machine of a specific size in a specific region. You can get very, very granular such that if they try to create anything else, it's just going to say, no, you don't have rights to do that. And so that's wonderful about Cloud Slice, because you can really manage the capabilities of the student and keep your costs really, really tightly managed to what your lab is all about. Now, actually, I'm going to click this window, exit, because I don't usually add resources that way, and it was doing everything. And I'm going to just try doing it this way instead. There, that's what I was expecting. So I'm just going to create a new resource in my resource group. In this case, it's just going to be a storage account, which is a pretty basic resource. Storage account. So I mean, if you think about a virtual machine and virtualized hardware, you've got compute, which is your CPU. You've got networking, right? All the NIC cards that you connect to various things in your network. And you've got storage, which is your hard drive space and where you put all your data. And so you'll hear people talk in the cloud about compute, network, and storage as three base pillars for cloud. And then there's other stuff beyond that. And so in this case, I'm going to create a storage account, which is something that's very commonly created with other resources. You will notice sometimes you deploy a resource in the cloud and it deploys other things too, because a virtual machine isn't a virtual machine necessarily without some kind of IP address or networking or just different stuff. And so some of these resources are pre-configured to deploy with a bunch of bundles but broken out atomically, which is actually nice because then you can add additional atomic items. If you want multiple IP addresses, multiple network cards, you get that kind of lower level management while you're working with cloud resources. Just like inside of a computer, you can work with the whole thing, the big box, or you can crack it open and stick a new network card in there and stick an additional hard drive in there. So you get that level of access. So let me do storage account creation here. And so I'll click on create. And I can do this as we talked about because I didn't restrict it at all. And so I'm just going to do SA and then some random. I'm going to talk about names here for a second. So that name's not taken, which is great. I just hammered away at my keyboard. When you're dealing with virtual machines, you don't have to think about naming of resources inside of those virtual machines conflicting with naming of resources inside of the virtual machine next to it, or physical machines. Or you don't have to think about the naming of that stuff conflicting with one another. You might have to think about the virtual machine itself, the computer on the network, that name conflicting with another name in the network. So at the point where resources are going to cross one another's paths, there is potential for conflict in naming. And of course, you have that inside of Azure subscriptions, whether you're dealing with Cloud Slice or with Azure Pass. Some resources have to have a name that is unique within your subscription. Some resources have to have a name that is unique globally. A great example is thinking about, well, storage account is inside of your subscription versus globally unique needs to be things, or for things like like your web server, right? Your web server, you put it out on the internet and you have a DNS name for it, and that DNS name needs to be unique. Otherwise, you're going to have conflicts.
Or like an IP address.
Or an IP address, that's right. And so within our Cloud Slice platform, we have ways that you can leverage. If you look up on the top right corner here where it says Morgan and then this number, that number is designed to make it unique. And we have easy ways you can leverage in your instructions for your labs. You can have them actually, you can generate dynamic names inside lab instructions and tell the student, okay, I want you to create a storage account called SA and then this unique thing that's automatically appended. And the student doesn't know you did that appending stuff. They just see a name with a bunch of random stuff at the end of it, and they can click to copy and then paste it in. And so you can make these things work really well with one another. So enough rambling about that. So I'm just going to click on, oh, wait, what's my errors? I'm missing something. Oh, yeah. So I'm creating a storage account inside of my resource group.
Now, an interesting note here. Can a student actually go and create their own resource group, or do they have to work within the one that's already created for them?
So they can if they are using an Azure Pass, because they are working with a subscription that they manage and own, so they can go and create whatever resources that they want. But if you're dealing with Cloud Slice, the way we manage Cloud Slice is the piece of the pie or the piece of the pizza that you get is resource group level access where those resource groups are already created for you. We don't let you go and create additional resource groups. You just have access to the ones that were created for you and given to you to work with the lab. And that's intentional so that there is no pollution of resources from one student to another, so that so that you can actually put policies in place to manage the resources students can create and keep your costs lower, and all of those nice features that really make the experience rich.
Now also, if you want to have multiple resource groups within a single lab, you can go into LOD and you can actually outline those resource groups. So if you wanted to say, for example, have 3 different resource groups that the student would work within, they could be set up in LOD in a way that when the user launches a lab, it'll create 3 resource groups for them to work within, and they won't be able to work anywhere outside of those 3. So you're not only limited to necessarily one resource group, but they can't create their own outside of LOD.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and I've recently used that too in the Skunkworks labs that I did, where I showed how you can create chat where students can chat with one another inside of a lab. There are resources that are deployed in that lab that a student doesn't even see because it's a website. They don't need to see the actual website and muck around with it inside of Azure and change the configuration, but it's provisioned for them. And then all the student gets access to is the DNS address to actually go and hit that website on the web. So you can create resources that are available for each student to work with that they don't even see inside of Azure, so they can't break, but they're leveraging from another access point like an API or a DNS name or something along those lines. So there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what students can see and cannot see. So I've created my going back to my resource groups here. So I've created my storage account and a little message popped up saying it was done. And so now I've got a very simple resource group here with hardly anything in it, just a storage account. The reason why I wanted to go through this is because this is the process you're going to go through if you're creating cloud labs. You're going to create a resource group, not necessarily in Cloud Slice. I'm doing that for simplicity of this demo. You'll just take your subscription, sign in with your credentials, create a resource group, maybe call it website lab or something that means something to you about what the lab is that you're working on. And maybe it's one or more, maybe it's multiple resource groups, depending on how you're setting it up. And you can then create your resources that you want the students to either create or work with. And then you can, inside of the Azure UI, I'm looking at my resource group, which has one or more resources. In this case, it's just a storage account. And I can click on this automation script thing. And what this gives me is this funky, weird looking things with curly braces. And curly braces are kind of interesting because there is a joke around the office that Robert and I, who are both developers, all we like to talk about is curly braces. But that's not true. And here we are talking about Azure and concepts at a higher level. Yet, yes, we included curly braces. So, at any rate, this is a JSON document, and this document is a Azure feature. This isn't something that we do. I mean, it's just in the Azure portal. It is a set of instructions that Azure knows how to read to recreate the resources in this resource group. And so part of the process when you create these kinds of labs and you think about the idea of if you're going to build a computer, you need to order your CPU and your motherboard and your graphics card and the different pieces you need. Well, in the cloud, you think about the same things. My students are going to need a storage account and a website, and they're going to need an Azure function and maybe a logic app and a database. And you put this stuff together, and then you go to your resource group where you built this thing virtually, and you go into the automation script and you say, okay, now I want to get that collection of resources in a way that I can recreate it so that I can plug it into the Lab on Demand Cloud Slice feature and have each student get their own unique set of those resources.
Now, this resource group is kind of like a cookie cutter, right? It basically outlines how all the resources are going to be created. So it's, what about if you want to make one resource group different than the other, right? You can use the parameters.
That's correct. Yeah. So in this case, if you look right here at the very top, so I mean, this is just a big garbled string of text, but that's the actual name of the storage account that I created. And if I took this, and that's set up as a default value, right? If I took this template, saved it out to disk, used either Azure itself to launch this template or PowerShell, because you can launch them with PowerShell, or the AZ Azure command line tool. You can use that to actually deploy, I shouldn't say launch, but they're actually for deploying templates into an Azure subscription. If I don't give it parameters, it's going to create these resources exactly as they were when I generated my template. And that means if two resources have the same name and they can't in a subscription, sometimes they can because they're inside of a resource group. And if it's as long as it's another resource group, I won't have a conflict. But if they can't in the same resource group or a higher level in the same subscription or at a higher level globally, each time you got to think about where those resources need to be unique, then you can use parameters to make those names unique and leverage things like what we refer to, you might hear as you get into Cloud Slice terminology, replacement tokens. That's our fancy way of saying you can grab these strings that are dynamic and unique to each lab that's running. Each student gets their own set of replacement tokens, their username, their password, their lab instance ID. Well, that's the same for, lab instance is unique for the students. Lab profiles are the same. And so some of them are the same for all students in the lab. Some of them are unique for all students worldwide. And so you can leverage these, find these tokens and use them in your name generation for the parameters. So I could take this package and say, yeah, I want to redeploy this as a Cloud Slice. And for my storage account name, I want to call it SA and then grab that unique identifier that is unique for my Cloud Slice lab and deploy it that way.
So how do you bring this into LOD? I mean, there's this massive text blob here, and I mean, if you're ambitious, you can write it out by hand, or you can use Azure to generate it, but eventually we have to get this into LOD, right?
Yes, so the way you get this into LOD, well actually, yeah, so I wonder if we should hold that off. We have a talk tomorrow on advanced cloud slicing, where we spend more time on what are ARM templates. So ARM, Azure Resource Manager. Azure Resource Manager ARM templates. That's what this is called. And so we spend more time on ARM templates and on restriction policies and on some of these provisioning things and just kind of going into more granular detail. So showing how that works inside of LOD, I wonder if that would be better for that talk. But I will mention that when you're working, like here I'm in Azure and I'm trying to introduce you and transition you from working with virtual hardware or physical hardware and what that looks like with the cloud and how that makes sense. I will mention that when you're taking these different pieces, whether it's your policy or your resource definitions, working with them in LOD, you just take them as is with no modifications as long as your parameters are set up properly, and you can drop them into LOD and then invoke them in a Cloud Slice with parameters and they will just deploy. So that's something we'll show you maybe a little bit more tomorrow, unless I have time here, but we're trying to be conscious of our time. One thing I do want to get at, actually that's the segue for the next section. So I'm going to go back here for a minute. I think I've talked about Azure in general and the concepts of Azure at a high level pretty well. Let me just take a glance up and see. Okay, there's no questions on Twitter. If anybody does have any questions about these things, feel free to tweet out to us. And there is a hashtag ADV developer to get our attention. And that way, or just also our Twitter handle is @LOD Systems. And feel free to tweet out questions if you do have any questions about what we are presenting here. And we'll try to keep an eye on that channel. So coming out of Azure for a minute, and I might go back into it, but anyway, coming out of Azure for a minute, we talked about Cloud Slice and Azure Pass, and we already hit on a few of these points, but I wanted to call it out on a specific slide so that you could really get a feel for when you're going to use one versus the other. And why would we have two different ways? It's important for us to have two different ways. So Cloud Slice, which is my favorite of the two, I mean, I use it all the time and I love it. It's incredibly easy to set up. It's fast. I can create a Cloud Slice lab in 3 steps. It takes me just a few minutes and get something off the ground running. And then focus on adding instructions and fleshing out what the students want to learn and the story that's going to make the student leave that lab with the knowledge in hand that they were hoping to get when they started it. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on the resource creation too much. So you can get set up very, very, very fast. It's got a minimal onboarding experience. So students can launch a lab and come in at ground zero with no resources. Like you saw, I just came in here to a Cloud Slice lab. I had nothing other than a resource group. And that's great when you're trying to teach students about Azure 101 and you need to go and create a brand new website and deploy it. And what's that mean and how do you go through that process? You can do those kinds of labs. Or there's the next point, resources can be pre-deployed. We talked about that, the ARM template. So the ARM template that I can generate in Azure and then export and then load into LOD, and we'll go into more detail tomorrow. I can pre-deploy resources or I can deploy them while the lab is running so that when the student gets to a certain point, they have those resources available. And we even have a system where you can actually notify students. So if you are doing deployment that's happening at the same time as a student starts a lab, you can send them a notification at the beginning saying, hey, by the way, you can get started with the lab, but there are some resources that are being deployed in the background, and those resources will be available to you at a later time. We'll let you know when. And so the student's going through their instructions, and all of a sudden, ding, a little pop-up comes up, another notification saying, hey, your resources are ready, just so you know. So you can really kind of make that experience rich for them as they go through the lab. Which, if you go back to the virtual machine model and you think about that, imagine somebody getting into a lab with a virtual machine where it's not even built yet, and the resources are being dynamically put together behind the scenes, and you're going and grabbing this network card and the graphics card and all this stuff, and then ding, oh, it's ready. That's a little ridiculous, but I mean, that's kind of a concept in terms of things being built on the fly, while students can do some stuff, and then they get into a point where they need the other things later. Maybe they have to grab a cup of coffee while they wait if it's not quite ready yet, but you can still fast track them on their learning experience a whole lot. Less time required to learn. Because of that fast tracking, because resources can be pre-deployed, I can bring them into a scenario. I'm not starting them on saying power on the machine, wait for it to boot up, sign in, now go and launch this, deploy that, install this thing, all these different stuff. I mean, well, virtual machines, you can pre-set up a bunch of different stuff, but you can do the same thing in a cloud. And you can get them off the ground running so that you say, okay, here's the scenario. You have a database that is properly configured, but your website app is not able to pull data out of it. And you need to figure out why. Is it permissions? Is it the connection string? Is it some other setting along the way? Is it something named improperly? How do you figure that stuff out? You can bring them into these real life scenarios and say, okay, go, which is great for training for students inside of a lab. It's also great for scenarios if you're a company and you're hiring people and you want to check out their chops, and you could create a lab and have them come in and work through these scenarios real time and see how they respond to these challenging situations that they set up for them. There's nothing stopping you from doing that.
Another great thing about the cloud slice too is that, let's say, for example, the student completely destroys their environment and it's irrecoverable. With a cloud slice, all they need to do is just cancel their lab and launch a new one, and everything just springs back up again. Whereas, say, for example, an Azure Pass, they'd have to run through the process manually of recreating some of the resources.
Yes, that's a great point. And in Azure, because they're recreating resources, it means they have to delete them. And if they didn't delete everything and then they're redeploying afterwards, and they miss something, they might hit an error. And so it's just a bit more of a challenging process. So that's a really, really great point. You can you're wipe clean. And we're in a world of disposable resources with resources running in the cloud where you can just throw them away and then fire them back up again with ease. And that's awesome for learning. They're lower cost. So we talked about the fact that in my quick demo that I showed you where I could create resources, I could create the most expensive virtual machine under the sun. And I keep going back to virtual machines just because those are high cost resources. There are other high cost resources as well. SQL databases that have expensive installations because of managed SQL requiring a license and stuff like that. But I can I can really, really reduce the cost in my labs by making my labs focused on students are working with this technology, these resource types. That's all they can create, nothing else. And so there's no bleed or curiosity or somebody who's feeling a little mischievous going and creating these things. They can't. They're blocked from it. So I manage my resources really tightly. And unlike Azure Labs, when the cloud slice is done and the student logs out, those resources are torn down. And so there's no incurring cost going on behind the scenes. Versus a pass, you'd have to have the students manually tear it down as part of your instructions or go through and clean up after the fact, have some automation scripts that do that sort of thing. And so you'd have to manage that yourself. But with Cloud Slice, that's managed for you. So your costs are greatly reduced. Restriction support, we talked about that. That's about not being able to deploy certain resources and the resources turned down, and that's that lab point I just hit on. So that's Cloud Slice. Do you want to go through the Azure Pass stuff?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Great.
So kind of the opposite side of what Kirk said before about, automatically tearing down some of the resources. There may also be scenarios where you want to allow the student to keep their subscription after the class. This kind of lets them work with their resources after the fact. So let's say they have a 1-month subscription up to $100 that they're allowed to use. Once they're done taking their lab, they can get back into their Azure subscription after the fact and continue to work with it, or continue to kind of experiment with different setups, or just, learn some new things about Azure. So it kind of extends past the end of the lab, which can be useful in some cases. Another really big difference is Cloud Slice is very similar to how Hyper-V would say, partition a computer into virtual machines. So Cloud Slice is partitioning a single subscription. So you can't really give the student access to the entire subscription. So for Azure Pass, if there's some things that you want to do, like give the student full admin access to the subscription so they can learn how to, delegate permissions, create tenants, and basically do anything that they want, then Azure Pass is definitely a better fit. And we have options for either case. There's also the idea that in an Azure Pass, since it's their own subscription, a student can go through and create anything that they want. They're not being restricted by anything other than the amount of time and cost that they incur. So if the student decides that they want to go set up a very large Hadoop cluster or something and just leave it running for 2 days, they can do it, but it'll saturate their entire subscription credit within the 2 days. But they have the ability to create whatever they want, which can be beneficial for your lab because, again, whether it's something that you want to be experimental or you want to limit the cost to only $50 per student, then the Azure Pass might be a better fit in that scenario. So you also have some amount of cost control per student as well.
Thanks, Robert. That was great. So I think that we've talked pretty well about the differences, comparing and contrasting between Cloud Slice and Azure Pass, when you're going to need either. If you still don't get this and you don't have the questions right now because this is brand new stuff for you and you tinker with it later on, feel free to reach out to us and contact our support, or reach out to us on Twitter or whatever you're most comfortable with, and let us know what questions you have so that we can make sure that you're on the right path to success for what your needs are. Now, moving beyond choosing between the different types of cloud subscriptions you can work with, let's talk about Cloud Slice resources. So we already talked a lot about I already did the demo going into creating resources in Azure and generating an ARN template. But what if you don't even want to do that? Well, there's a whole world of people out there working with Azure. Wouldn't it be great if some of those people were creating these templates to deploy these certain things, these various configurations or computers, but they're resource packages, and just offering them up there where you could go and grab it and then tweak it and modify it? Well, if I flip over to the Azure Quickstart templates, so this, if you just search on the web for Azure Quickstart Templates, you're going to find this page. There's actually two resources that you'll find. One is this one, and another one is a GitHub page, because this is just a front end beyond on top of a GitHub repository where all these things are stored. And this brings me into Azure Quickstart Templates and a lot of Azure Quickstart Templates. So 665 currently in the gallery. And I can come in here and I can search for web app and hit enter. And so I get a filtered down list as it goes through and figures out, okay, well, what templates match that filter? Oh, there's 19 of those. Or there I see another one, Kosmos Db. So if you know the kind of resources that you need to teach students to learn about, you can use this filtering mechanism and find these templates. And then when you find one that you like, and so let's do one that's got web app with SQL, Cosmos DB, and Azure Search and Application Insights, so quite a few things. And these are community contributions and some from Microsoft, and there's this repository. You click through, you can read about it, you can say, okay, yeah, that sounds good. There's the parameters that are available for it, so describing what the parameters are that are already set up in the actual template. And then you can go and look, okay, I'm going to go look on GitHub. Or if you've already looked on GitHub, you could just go and deploy it directly into Azure into your own subscription and have a look at the resources that come out of that, and then tweak and go through the generating the template based on your configuration, so that there's a cycle you can go through that is basically find an example that you want to start with and either do some modifications, take it as is, import it in Azure, modify it there, and then export it again, and a lot of flexibility. And if I jump to GitHub, if you look at this particular template in the GitHub repo, it's got two main files, Azure deploy.json and Azure parameters, deploy.parameters.json. And this guy, Azure deploy.json, that's the ARM template itself. That's like what we generated inside of our subscription earlier, where you've got all these curly braces. There's those curly braces again, and details describing this resource package and how it's going to go into your subscription for students. So that's a great resource.
Also, if you're not familiar with GitHub, we're going to be talking about it a little bit more in other sessions, right?
Yes, absolutely.
About how we can integrate this with LOD and how we can basically pull these templates directly into LOD. The nice thing that this gives too is version control, right? If we decide that we wanted to create a clone or a fork of this template and customize it ourselves, we don't have to do all the work and rewrite the whole thing or copy. We could just create a fork and then bring that into LOD after we've made our modifications.
Right.
So that really kind of accelerates the process.
Oh, and just so you know, when we talk about fork, we're not talking about 2 tines or 3 tines or 4 tines. We're talking, a fork is just a term that's used in the world of GitHub, where you say, okay, I want to take this thing that somebody else did, make my own copy of it. So you're forking it. It's a fork in the road. And so they have theirs, and yours is a fork off of that, and then you can tweak it, modify it, and work with it. So that's just so you know. So I'm going to jump back for a second. So this is our administration page, which if you worked with virtual machines and virtual labs, you're already familiar with it inside of our environment, if you've already used those. And I want to just call out the cloud pieces. And so there's this cloud services tab. And so this is where you're going to go through and do setup of cloud, whether it's Azure Pass or Cloud Slice. And how do you get these things in here? The resource templates, you can see cloud resource templates. That's for ARM templates. Restriction policies, that's about how do you restrict your resources, your resource groups, so students can't create too many things that you don't want them to. And I specifically want to call out something fairly new. And so there's this help button at the top. And this is relatively new, this system of help that we've added. And what we're doing is we've taken, let me just set up a split screen here so you can see it pretty well. We have taken our documentation and decided to dog food our own learning experience and give you a split screen view where you go into Lab on Demand help. And inside of here, there's Quickstarts. And the first Quickstart that we've done so far, and there's absolutely more to come, is building your first Cloud Slice lab, which ties into a lot of the talks that we're delivering at this event. And inside of that, there is configuring your cloud subscription for use with LOD. And so when you decide, yes, this is good, I get their points, I want to try it out, I've gone and bought an Azure subscription, or I've signed up for an Azure Pass or a trial, and I want to start trying Cloud Slice. Come in here, click on Help, go to this Configure Your Cloud Subscription for Use with LOD. As you can see, there's a duration, it takes about 20 minutes. There are some things that you need to do to give us access to your subscription, because the only way this magic can happen is if you let LOD in the door so it can go and provision the resources, set up the user accounts, create the resource groups, set the restriction policies, all of that stuff for you. You need to open up the door for us to let us in. And that particular Quickstart is about that. And it's a one-time thing per subscription. You go through and you create those resources. And then after that, you go through and you configure it. After that, you can then add your subscription into LOD, at which point you can start using it. Then there's creating a Cloud Slice in 3 steps. And so I really like this transition, this way to learn Cloud Slice. And so I encourage people to go through it, and please share with us your feedback, because that would be really, really helpful to us. Now, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I don't want to run out of time. And so I'm going to jump to the next slide. And I want to talk about something really important when you're dealing with cloud. And whoops, let me go back. And so just like, okay, so going back to traditional learning inside of a learning center, you could have a classroom where you can have 30 students, and you can't take more than 30. The 31st person at the door, they can't come in. You only allow signups up to your maximum because you have a finite number of resources available for students to actually learn those concepts. Cloud is the same. You have a finite number of resources that are available. And how you manage that, you need to do a bit more math. In a physical room, in a training center, it's easy. How many seats do I have? How many computers? Okay, that's great. I know how many people I can support. Inside of the cloud, when you're dealing with, well, maybe if you're teaching a cloud lab inside of a room, you can still count those seats and resources to get your head count. But the important thing is, whether it's inside of a training center room or inside of an office training room or offered online to a certain number of signups or offered online to an unlimited number of signups, you need to think about how many people are going to come in. And so maybe you have registration to track the number of people who are actually going to do it, and only the people who register can take the course. And then this is specifically with Cloud Slice, because with Azure Pass, each person has their own subscription, and so you don't have this resource constraint, right? But Cloud Slice you do. Although you have some constraints with Azure Pass that you need to think about. We'll get to that in a second. And so you need to think about how do I scale? So inside of my lab, I'm going to be teaching people how to deploy a website which needs a storage account and it needs a database on the back end. And so those 3 resources times that number of students that I've calculated, maybe it's 200 students. So it's 200 of each of these resource types. Your Azure subscription comes when you first sign up for Azure and you get a subscription. It comes with built-in limits. And those limits are set relatively low in some cases, depends on the type of resource. But for example, virtual machine, the number of cores of each VM type, I think the default is 10. That's not going to support many students working with virtual machines inside of an Azure lab with only 10 cores, especially if you pick a 2-core VM, then you can only support 5. And if you had 4 students and one of them decided to create 3 VMs because they were trying to experiment a bit more, you've got conflicts. You've got limitations on your resources. You need to figure out your minimum set, and then some multiplier above and beyond that. Maybe it's times 2, maybe it's 40% higher, something that you're comfortable with that gives you a buffer to allow that number of resources. And then you need to go into Azure in your subscription or subscriptions and set those limits higher. And with the resources, I'm just going to check something really quick. I want to do a time check. Okay, I'm good. With the resources, when you go into your subscription and you set up your limits, some of those limits have a maximum, but in many cases that they don't, or they have a maximum that's high enough that you're not going to see it unless you get into really, really huge labs. And so you need to send a message to Microsoft Azure, and there's a UI for that, and you can search about how to increase my limits, where you say, I need to increase the limits for the number of CPUs of this type in this region from the default of 10 to 200. And they give you a default turnaround of that. Usually it's like 3 business days. If they're really busy, it might be 5. I've put in a request that was fairly last minute where they came back and said, yeah, so you know the fact that this is a cloud, this isn't what they said, I'm paraphrasing. You know that this is a cloud, right? But behind the cloud, there's physical resources in the data center, and we're at capacity in this particular region, in the data center in this region, and we can't take on that load right now. So we can do your limit increase, but it's going to be 6 weeks from now. And if you're just about to give a course next week, then that's an holy moly scenario. What do I do? Well, switch to another region and ask them if they can do the increases in another region and very quickly adjust. Fortunately, there's a huge number. Do you know the number? How many Azure regions?
There's a lot.
Yeah.
I don't have a direct count, but there's quite a few.
Right.
And actually, since we're talking about finite resources, there's another very finite resource that every lab developer wants to keep their eye on, and that's how much this is going to cost. And there's actually a question up here that's very much related. It says, is there a way to schedule the cost of Azure subscriptions? An example, parcel pizza slices over 5 days, since we're on the topic of pizza boxes, pizza slices fits.
Yeah.
So Azure bills based off of time. So if you limit your lab to only be able to run for 2 hours a day, and you also restrict what resources they can deploy, then you can say, okay, well, they're going to run an A2 VM that's going to cost, say, roughly $20 a day. So what you can do is by restricting what they deploy and how long they can run the lab for, you can in turn limit your costs per day. So in that example, you'd say give them an hour a day for 5 days, and that's going to run up to $100. And then that would be the end of their lab or the end of their ability to run the lab. So that's how you would control costs, using the restriction policies and using time constraints on how long the lab can run.
Yeah. That's absolutely great points. And these things apply to, we're talking Cloud Slice, but you also have limits inside of your Azure Passes, right? And so if you're telling students to deploy more resources than they have access to in their passes, I mean, that's not that likely, but you need to think about it anyway, just because the limits are there. We support subscription pooling, which we talk about in some of our other sessions in more detail. The basic principle is that Azure has maximum limits, as I mentioned. One particularly low maximum is storage accounts, which the upper maximum, the highest you can go, is 250. And there are a lot of resources that you deploy where each of those resources needs their own storage account. And so if you're deploying that type of resource and you want to support 300 students, and that means 300 storage accounts, how do I do that? Well, we support pooling. So by default, all subscriptions go into a pool, even if it's only a pool of one subscription in our platform. And then you add more so that we load balance across it and bypass some of these lower limits. So if you want to do a lab or offer multiple labs where the number of simultaneous storage accounts you need to support gets into the range of 500, you just need to add enough subscriptions with limits high enough that the load balancing total cost will fit under your umbrella of the upper maximum. So that's what subscription pooling is about. And as a last note, be mindful of optional features. So by default, Azure has certain features turned off. If students are using an Azure Pass, they can just turn them on because they're admin over the subscription. If they're using Cloud Slice, they don't have access to turn on those optional features. So you need to identify what those are and turn them on. And the best way you do that is by running through your tests for your lab, and you see, oh, it can't deploy this resource because that resource type is optional, not on by default. I got to go back to all of my subscriptions in the pool of that's configured, that's connected to this lab, and make sure that that feature is on so that no matter which subscription the student hits, they get that feature. And so you just need to be mindful of that. And with that, ignoring the extra text at the bottom of the window that shouldn't be there, thank you very much for attending this session. We hope you got a lot out of it. Keep the conversations going and watch our other sessions on Cloud Slice that we have going on at this event, and then reach out to us after and let us know what you're trying to do, because we have a lot going in this area and it's really exciting and a lot of fun, and I think you can feel some of our enthusiasm about it. So we're happy to share it with you. So thanks again, and we'll see you in the next talk.